Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. This is Sarah Small. I'm Food Tank's Global Events Director. I'm really excited about today's webinar with Dr. Roger Leakey. Dr. Leakey is a crop physiologist and tree biologist who has worked in forestry and agroforestry aimed to reverse deforestation and desertification in the tropics. Today, his presentation will focus on the global food crisis. Can we heal an ailing and divided world? This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com afterwards. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using #FoodTank. Also, please submit your questions using the questions tab in your control panel or email them to me, Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, @foodtank.com. So without further ado, Dr. Leakey, it's wonderful to have you here today, and I'm excited to hear your presentation. I will give you the floor now.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Well, I think Food Tank is doing an excellent job at raising awareness around food issues. So I'm very happy to have an opportunity to make this small contribution to your cause. Addressing this title, The Global Food Crisis, Can We Heal a Divided and Ailing Planet, in 30 minutes is obviously a rather ambitious task. However, I will attempt to point you in a direction that I believe to be useful and relevant. The slide hasn't changed. For some reason, the slides are not working.
Dr. Leakey, if you pull up the PowerPoint program and you click to the right, it should change for you.
Okay, all right. It was working earlier. All right, great. Okay. So let's first of all remind ourselves of the scale of the big problems. Here in green, you can see the environmental issues, and in blue are the socioeconomic issues. And all of these numbers are huge and mainly affecting, I think, the same set of people. So something like a half of the world's population, mainly living in the tropics and subtropics, are suffering from some or all of these problems. In the smaller box in the left-hand side, I add some extra facts that I think emphasize some important points peculiar to these issues. So the fact that there are 75% of farmers in the third world that are hungry and malnourished is really rather extraordinary, because these are the people you would expect to be the least suffering the least. The comparison then between the number of people in the rural population, 80% in Africa, and less than 1% in Europe, and I think probably the US as well, is another very big contrast. And the fact that the average farm size is only 2.4 hectares, again, is a big contrast with other parts of the world. So recognizing this scale, let's briefly remind ourselves of how history has resulted in what I'm calling a two-tier society. In effect, the haves and the have-nots, driven, I think, by agricultural development. So first of all, we have had in the past colonialism, I think, creating a two-tier agricultural system with expatriate-owned large-scale plantation agriculture for export commodities, and on the other side, small-scale subsistence farming. Then moving on to globalization, again, we have a two-tier marketing of food crops, the trade regulation of commodity crops against the informal local markets. And then finally, we had the Green Revolution, which I think presented us with a two-tier technology for staple food crops, the high input mechanized farming technologies against the manual, small scale, low or no input agriculture. The consequence of this is a geographically based and unequal world with very different approaches to agriculture and very different lifestyles. And this map shows the percentage of people living on less than $1.25 a day, and also the different forms of agriculture, the mechanized versus the manual. And in the small boxes, you can see the comparative income So in Africa, something like $450 a day against a total of 67,000 for a farmer in the UK. I shouldn't have said 450 a day. I should have said 450 for a year for the tropical farmers, about $1.25 a day. The next two slides, I think, will just illustrate that in a bit more detail. This large-scale industrial agriculture, as you're familiar with it in the US, versus small-scale, low-input farming systems based often on deforestation, then rapidly going into a loss of soil fertility and land degradation, and in this case, the worst case scenario is obviously very severe erosion, like you see in the bottom right-hand picture. So what we end up with then is a divided world, and I would argue a dysfunctional world, especially with regard to food supply. And I think the practical question then is, how do we turn this situation around to ensure that everybody gets the food they need without destroying our planet? Lots of people, of course, have said the solution is a more sustainable approach to agriculture. But in fact, I think almost none of them, if any, have actually gone on to say how we can actually do that form of sustainable agriculture. Just before leaving this introduction, I want also to raise one more question, and that is, to what extent are the other big social issues of terrorism, crime, drugs, civil war, immigration also a consequence of the social injustice that has arisen in the world? And to what extent is it prevalent and a result of this dysfunctional world? And does this have any association with agriculture? Okay, from that introduction, let's go on to see what's actually happening on farms. For some time, I think it's been recognized that poverty and land degradation are closely linked. And we see in this slide the downward spiral that results from poverty driving land degradation and land degradation driving poverty. In my next slide, I've tried to elucidate that downward spiral in a bit more detail. And it involves a complex set of social, economic, and environmental issues that are seldom recognized, I think, by policymakers. So if we start at the top of the nasty web diagram with a desire for security and wealth, that leads to unsustainable use of natural resources, ecosystem degradation and soil erosion, loss of biodiversity, breakdown of ecosystem functions, all of that resulting in loss of crop yields and going on to hunger, malnutrition, and declining livelihoods. And then that spiraling right way around back to the top of the diagram with a desire for security and wealth. And to the left and to the right, excuse me, there are other impacts which we haven't got time to go into at the moment. But you can see then that this is a complex and downward spiral, adding more detail to the one in the previous slide. So I think it drives what in effect is a yield gap in small-scale, low-input smallholder agriculture. And by a yield gap, I mean in the left-hand picture, we have the potential yield of a maize crop, as you would see in ideal conditions on a research station. And in the right-hand picture, a rather poor example of actual yield in a poor farmer's field, where farmers have limited or no access to inputs and particularly to cash. So in effect, this yield gap is the result of an efficiency gap in agricultural technology. So just think a bit more about the yield gap. If this is a graph of maize yield, you can see that the biological potential is somewhere around 8 tons per hectare, 7 or 8 tons per hectare, and the actual farmers are actually achieving on average for Africa only 1.5 tons. So there's this massive difference between potential yield and actual yield, and these are figures in the small box are the averages for Africa. So it seems to me that The solution we need is not to try and improve potential yield, but we've actually got to try and fill that yield gap. Excuse me. So what I'm going to present is a three-step model, if you like, a generic model for how we can go about and start thinking about and perhaps applying techniques to fill that yield gap. So I'm suggesting that it has to be done in two stages. Step 1 and then steps 2 and 3, which run together. So what I'm aiming at then is to see if we can reverse the cycle of land degradation and social deprivation, such that now land rehabilitation drives enhanced livelihoods, and enhanced livelihoods drives land rehabilitation. And we're going to be looking at a bottom-up approach, so that we're working and finding out what farmers, starting by asking farmers what they actually want from agriculture and what they see as the main constraints, and working then with those communities to try and lead them through a process to close the yield gap and improve their livelihoods. So I think it boils down to needing to simultaneously do three things. First of all, we have to restore biological resources and natural capital. By that I mean things like soil fertility, water, forest vegetation, etc. We need to restore agroecological processes, that's the nutrient and water cycles, pest and disease control, and things of that sort. And thirdly, we need to try and enhance the livelihoods of poor farmers, and particularly there looking at nutrition, health, culture, equity, and importantly also income. And these are three things which I think are not being achieved in the developing world by intensive high input mechanized monocultural agriculture. So my alternative is to see how we can do these three things simultaneously using a highly adaptable generic model that can be modified to different circumstances. So let's just look at that in a bit more detail. In the left-hand photograph of this slide, in step 1, we're seeing the use of leguminous trees and shrubs to restore soil nitrogen. So in just 2 or 3 years of improved fallow with a leguminous tree or shrub, you can take maize yields from something like the 1 to 2 tons per hectare that we saw was what farmers are achieving, up about halfway up that yield gap to 4 to 5 tons, just by restoring soil nitrogen. To go further then requires P and K and other inputs, and that cannot be done biologically. So I think if we're going to go to that level, then we need to generate income so that the farmers can buy those inputs. And if they do that and apply those fertilizers, then as we saw earlier, they can get to the sort of yields that are found on research stations. In the pie diagrams at the bottom, you see a change in the way the farm is structured over this period, because in the really degraded farms, the farm has to be almost entirely put down to a maize crop that yields very little. As we diversify it and improve it, both with the legumes and then with the income generating opportunities, you can see that we change that farm structure and create a more balanced set of, say, 4 or 5 different small enterprises. So we can use then species like Sesbania or Calliandra as shrubs to restore soil nitrogen in either improved fallows or what's called relay cropping. And that also starts to improve the agroecological functions of the soil, so that we're starting to create a more healthy soil environment as well as a more fertile one. And that can be done at very low cost. It's just really a matter of collecting seeds from the wild and planting those at high density on a small part of the farming system. The second step then is to generate some income, and when we talk to farmers in in West Africa originally, they all said that what we really want to do is to be able to cultivate the species that we used to gather from the forest, the species that are on which our culture and tradition is based, and we want now to be able to cultivate those because the wild resource is severely depleted, and we have to go further and further in search of those species. And so there are thousands of species around the tropics and subtropics that have contributed to people's income and to their diets. And many of those species are almost unknown to science. And so there's a lot of work to do to start to bring those into cultivation. But that work started 25 years ago, and we've made great progress. So it started by asking farmers in Cameroon which of all the species they used to gather would be their priority choice. And this diagram just shows you the 5 top species that they identified out of a group of about 20 or 30 species. And they're probably species that with which you're unfamiliar, and we haven't got time to go into all the details about them. But the idea is that these farmers already know in their own village which trees produce the best fruits, or the tastiest fruits, or the biggest fruits, or the ones that are more easily marketed. And so they can develop those as simple cultivars by applying practical horticulture, grafting and marcotting and rooting cuttings to be able to create very rapidly cultivars. And the process that is engaged in from the point of view of ICRAF and other organizations that are doing this is the provision of skills and knowledge that just allows those farmers to empower themselves to become self-sufficient and to make the decisions as to which ones they want to cultivate, which trees they want to cultivate, and what they're going to do with them. So if we just look at an example, this is the case of Safu in Cameroon. Here we see the sort of variation that you find in a wild population. And as I said earlier, this is a species which would be an important food crop, food species. And as you can see, it's locally marketed in the left-hand picture. The right-hand diagram shows the sort of morphological variation that you find in a single population. And you'll see associated with that some prices. So three biggish fruits in the middle selling for 250 Central African francs, and down at the bottom 22 fruits selling for only 50 francs. So that illustrates that not only do the markets recognize this variation, but it also recognizes that some of these trees are tastier or have other desirable characteristics. And so that's the baseline from which we can build a participatory domestication program. If you look at that in quantitative terms, then each of these graphs illustrates just that sort of variation, whether it's fruit morphology, whether it's medicinal properties, whether it's the essential oils in leaves or the edible oils or fatty acids in fruits and nuts. This is the common and typical pattern of tree-to-tree variation that's out there in any wild population. And it's exactly the same sort of variation as we see in populations of people, as you can see in the right-hand picture at the bottom. But the important point is that this occurs in every population. So if you're working in different villages in a country, each of those villages has the opportunity to utilize this kind of variation. And so something like 80% of the variation occurs at the village level. And that means we can develop a decentralized approach to tree domestication and get the best benefits for the people, but at the same time not seriously limit the genetic variation of the species. So it's a very nice technique to be able to identify which trees are going to be useful and the best for developing new cultivars. And I think to understand that perhaps a bit better, we need to look at the power of domestication. And what we're looking at here are domesticated wolves. So dogs are in effect varieties of a wolf. And what the dog breeders have done over long periods, hundreds of years, thousands of years perhaps, is to tweak out and tease out the genetic variation that's there in the wild wolf, and to take it in different directions, as you can see from the very different dogs that have been created. Now, I think we can do exactly the same thing for each of these tree food species, because the type of variation that we have in outbreeding species allows all this variation to be there. And in trees, we can, instead of breeding it to go forward, we can identify the best individuals in a wild population and develop a cultivar. That gives us a quantum leap straight away. And then in due course, we can cross between those best cultivars to take the thing forward. And so there's a real opportunity with these tree crops to create something new, productive, and very high quality with new market potentials. And so what we look at in this graph is ways in which we would want perhaps to make some selection. So if you're interested in a fresh fruit, for example, you want the left-hand diagram, a big fruit with lots of flesh, perhaps a small nut, and you want the flesh to be juicy, tasty, and nutritious. Or if you want more interested in the nut, then you want perhaps a small fruit with a big kernel in it, a thin shell so it's easily extracted, and then the high quality of the oil that may be in it, and also again more nutritious characteristics. So this is the sort of approach which is being used, and you can actually develop fruit cultivars and nut cultivars within the same species, because many of them have the opportunity to go either way. Just one example, one case study in the middle is Alan Black here, which is an oil crop which is being developed for Africa, and it has got to the point where the margarine was recently released onto the market in Europe. So these are real opportunities that we can go take forward to create marketable products from these sorts of species. So how do we do it? Well, it's basically with all that variation that we've identified in the wild, we choose, the farmers choose which trees they want to propagate to create as new cultivars. They can marcot them, or they can graft them, as in the second photograph here. Take that then to a village nursery, propagate that, bulk that up by rooting cuttings from it, and produce the small plant in the bottom right, which is already starting to produce fruits. You can see the fruits are almost at ground level there, within 2 or 3 years. So we're getting round the problems that many trees have if you go through the breeding route, that it takes a long time before you get any returns. This way, by developing cultivars with mature tissues, we can instantly get to a situation where those rooted cuttings will flower and fruit and start producing marketable and useful products. And those marketable and useful products are, of course, a uniform copy of the one that you started aiming to produce. So that's just standard horticulture, and it's a way of doing it in a low-tech manner that can be done in remote locations. Now, we're talking here mostly about foods, but of course the same approach can be equally well done to vegetables and fodder, resins and exudates, medicines and other extractives, wood products, so that the range of marketable products available to small farmers actually covers all of this sort of range, and all of these, the same approach can be used for all of these different kinds of products. Okay, so that takes us quickly through the domestication story. Then we move to the commercialization, and here many of these species are already marketed and have been marketed for a long time locally, sometimes regionally. And so we can start, I think, with those markets, start by enhancing opportunities to put greater quality into those markets, increase shelf life, and get other ways of improving the sorts of returns that we would get from those plants. From that left-hand end of this diagram, where we're seeing a traditional market stall, we can move towards perhaps a small, slightly improved cottage industry where some of the product is being dried and shelf life extended, and opportunities then to improve the marketing options and extend that through the seasons, and then move on to the next step, which would be to take that into a business set. As you can see, a range of species are already moving into that kind of development. So we're seeing the opportunities of developing these sorts of markets for these kinds of products. And the important step which we need to do in the development projects is to help farmers and other people in the rural communities to develop low-tech, simple methods of either drying products or cracking nuts or sealing them in plastic bags, extracting oil, etc., so that we can start to create these small cottage industries. Okay, so that quickly runs us through my three steps of this generic model: rehabilitation, domestication, and commercialization. And you can see that steps basically 1 and 2 give you a big jump into food security and domestic self-sufficiency. And then steps 2 and 3 together will help us to get towards improved income, opportunities for employment, entrepreneurism, and trade, with outcomes of further increase in income, empowerment, gender equity, opportunities then for education and improved infrastructures. And as I said, we can do this with a range of species that is adapted to almost any environment in the world, because there's such a wide range of species available for this kind of approach. So what I'm suggesting then is that we can greatly improve food security by closing the yield gap in this kind of way, by better crop husbandry. And the scale of that sort of impact, I think, can be 200 to 300% or 500%, whereas a crop breeding approach is probably only going to give us 5 or 10%. And so the real opportunities to move forward rapidly, I think, are there with this kind of approach. Now, in addition to improving food security, we can improve nutritional security, because many of these indigenous fruits and leaves and nuts are rich in micronutrients and therefore very important for people's health and well-being. And the experience of our work in Cameroon over the last 15 or so years has been that the communities can very rapidly make substantial improvements in their income. And the graph here on the left shows the income over a period of 10 years for the average for a number of communities in Cameroon that have been going this kind of route. And you can see they've gone from nothing to about $28,000 in 10 years. And that's been by selling plants from their village nurseries to neighboring villages, and also by selling these sorts of products, fruits and nut products, to those in the community and to those in neighboring communities and local towns. And as they get engaged into this kind of process, then the amount of revenue generated and the number of households engaged in this goes up. So money really does grow on trees. But if we go this route, we're not just generating money, we're also diversifying the agroecosystem, and I think promoting environmental sustainability. First of all, of course, by improving soil fertility, but also by creating a much more diverse farming system like the one you see on the right-hand side here, where you have a staple food crop monoculture as part of the farm and a more diverse tree cropping close by producing a wide range of other products in which we have a very wide range of biodiversity, which makes that ecosystem function better. If we scale all of that up, then we can, I think, also see that because we're planting perennial plants, we can sequester a lot more carbon. And numbers coming from ICRAF and others suggest that if we were to do this to 45% of the degraded land, we'd be able to mitigate the sorts of carbon CO2 emissions from agriculture. We're also, as I've said earlier, supporting tradition and culture, and all of that is important in social sustainability. And certainly the communities are very excited about the opportunities to go and develop these traditional systems and traditional products because they understand them, they understand the local markets, and they know how to use them, and they appreciate them in many, many ways. And as we've suggested earlier, we're also promoting the economic sustainability of the communities by helping them to get into small businesses, by helping them to create employment opportunities, and then to use the money from that first to buy fertilizers, but then to give access to health, education, and local infrastructure, and things like creating establishing wells in the village, establishing water pumps, etc. All important steps in the development of these communities. So what I'm suggesting then is that we can see a multi-factor exponential impact coming out of this kind of approach, both through the land rehabilitation steps and also through the enhanced livelihood. And I think then we can really see that we can improve food security, nutritional security, we can alleviate poverty, and we can start to have big impacts on the environmental rehabilitation. So I've mentioned once or twice a case study from Cameroon, which has now been running for about 15 years. And certainly what those communities are saying is that they see huge impacts on their life. They've been able to buy fertilizers and a cow. They've been able to send their family to school. They've been able to improve their house or build a well or improve their diets and education and opportunities. But the one result that they mention, which excites me the most, is that some of the youths are saying, well, we can now see a future for ourselves in our own villages. We don't have to migrate to the towns and cities looking for work. We can actually create our own careers at home. And I think that's a very important and exciting opportunity. So my story then is, I think we can reverse the cycle of land degradation and social deprivation. We can indeed close the yield gap, and we can see that we have a way forwards. So what this slide is showing is going back to my original spiderweb diagram, where we were seeing the cycle of land degradation and social deprivation. We can actually see that we can reverse that. The red arrows here suggesting the quick way from the step 1, and then the brown and the blue arrows showing how we can reverse the cycle through the processes of tree domestication and commercialization of those products to get back to the real impacts that we need of those new businesses, employment, etc., etc. So hopefully, I think we can say perhaps we don't really have a food crisis. Maybe we have more of a crisis of common sense. If we are to feed 8 to 10 or 12 billion people, I think we need a single, fully functional economic and social system that is based on sustainable agriculture, one in which trees play both agroecological and production roles in the revegetation and the rehabilitation of degraded land. So I think this means that we need the industrial nations to play a more constructive role in the tropics, helping to eliminate the division through a more sustainable approach to agricultural development. And so the blue arrows here trying to indicate the need for improved interaction and a more engaged way in which the North or the industrialized countries can actually work in the tropics itself, so that we're not just exporting natural resource to the industrial countries. We're actually developing the value adding and the processing and the industries actually in the tropics itself. Going back then to the concept of a two-tier agricultural system and the history we've seen in the past, I think we've seen the first tier, if you like, the industrial countries, the red arrows here, growing over the last few hundred years, and the yellow arrows in the tropics declining. And what we now need to see is this cross-fertilization between the two to create a new and more vibrant agricultural economy, and one that is diversified in all these many different ways. And so we have a cross-fertilization between tier 1 and tier 2. So what I think I've been presenting is an unconventional approach to agricultural intensification, where we're seeing sustainable intensification as being agroecology plus, and very importantly, plus income generation. And I believe this is a road to progress. And importantly, I think it's also a bottom-up, African designed approach to benefit particularly Africans, but also other people around the tropics. And in addition to that, then I think this approach also helps to alleviate the message highlighted in this African cartoon. White hands give a little and take a lot. We need to be getting a greater equity around the world. So I conclude that we can heal an ailing world, but the question is, can we actually acquire the political will to make the necessary changes? So, summary, drawing to a close, my summary is based around the cycle of land degradation, putting it in its historical context of population growth, globalization, social injustice, climate change. That, I think, is the issue, the problem that we're trying to address. And if we can reverse that cycle in the middle, then I think we can see we perhaps have a way forwards. So finally, the International Tree Foundation, of which I am vice chair, promotes the planting of trees, especially in Africa, for environmental rehabilitation and the enhancement of local livelihoods. And we would like to invite you to join our centenary project, aiming at planting 20 million trees in Kenya. Kenya is the country in which ITF originated some 91 years ago. And I hope that that is something which you might like to do. And finally, if I've said anything which interests you today, and about which you want to know more, then I hope you might be able to find it in this book, Living with the Trees of Life, Towards the Transformation of Tropical Agriculture. And there are some contact details there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Leakey. That was great and a really informative presentation. We do have a lot of questions from listeners, so for the next 10 minutes or so, we'll get through as many as possible. But just a reminder to our listeners as well to continue to send your questions either using the chat box, Twitter using #foodtank, or emailing me, sarah@foodtank.com. So Dr. Leakey, I'd like to start by asking you a question from a listener that reads, you mentioned using legumes to restore soil and fill the yield gap. Are you spreading this knowledge in a particular way to farmers or by providing seeds, etc.?
No, it's work which has been initiated by ICRAF at least 25 years ago. It's done by basically by farmer to farmer dissemination of information and by dissemination of seeds. So it's done very much at the local level. That many of the species are available locally. And it's basically a matter of acquiring those seeds from whatever source, and there are many different possible sources, and the farmers doing that for themselves.
Great, thank you. And our listener named Claire wants to know, what is the role of compost in returning nutrients to the land, and who would be funding these projects?
Well, compost is one source of organic matter, and one way of enriching the soil. So what I was suggesting is that by using leguminous trees and shrubs, you're getting the benefit of the biological nitrogen fixation, as well as being able to put that organic matter back into the soil. Who finances that? The whole objective of what I've been trying to get across to you is that much of this is things that the farmers can do for themselves. It doesn't actually require money, it requires skills and knowledge. And so the participatory domestication approach is one where people provide skills through farmer training schools, or what we call rural resource centers, without actually throwing money at farmers. I think it's very important to have a development system that is providing knowledge and understanding and skills rather than money, because I've been involved in so many large bilateral development programs over the years that pour money into a country or into a project for 2 or 3 years. Everything goes wonderfully for those 2 or 3 years, and perhaps for a year or two after, but then the whole thing dries up, and very often people are left worse off than they were before that development project. So this is a different approach to development. It's how do you do a bottom-up system of development that allows the farmers to get engaged and to do it for themselves, to become self-sufficient, and to be in control of the process for themselves, and to go at their own speed to make progress for themselves. And so it's a very different way of doing development, but I think it's a crucial one.
Great, thank you, Dr. Leakey. And the next question reads, how is the traditional knowledge of farmers being preserved or spread?
It's being preserved by them doing it for themselves. So it's very much the same answer as the last question, that these people have that traditional knowledge. Perhaps they won't have it for many more generations, but at the moment that is still there. And so they know that they have that information, and they can utilize that in whatever way meets their needs best. So it's not a matter of going around and telling people things, it's a matter of helping people to do things for themselves based on traditional knowledge, and adding to that some scientific knowledge and skills that give them the opportunity then to go into agroforestry, to go into horticulture, and to improve their lot.
Thank you again. And our listener, Ariana, wants to know if you can address the role of genetically modified crops in the equation that you presented.
Well, it's the system I've been presenting is one that doesn't require genetic modification, because there's so much variation out there already that we can fill that yield gap without having to go that route. One of the problems with genetic modification in the tropics is that if farmers don't have the money with which to buy fertilizers, then they don't have the money to buy seeds either. And so the question is whether genetically modified seed is actually an appropriate way for them at this stage in their development. So perhaps it's more important to come up with a technique that allows them to improve their food security by improving crop husbandry rather than by genetic modification. And as I did say earlier, also that by improving the breeding approach to improving potential yield doesn't seem to me to be the real opportunity of the moment. The real opportunity is to close that yield gap.
Great, thank you. And the next question reads, who could realistically start implementing this bottom-up approach like today or tomorrow? And I think regarding both large and small farms, but also geographically around the world.
Well, the first step is that the communities have to want it. And one of the things that ITF is experiencing at the moment is whenever we have money to contribute to rural development projects and put out a call for projects, we get many communities from around Africa and other parts of the tropics coming to us, and it's very clear that they understand what they want to do and what they need to do. They want to plant trees, they want to get the benefits of both fuel wood, timbers, fruits, nuts, and they want to have to improve the environment and get their areas revegetated. So anybody can do it. What we need, the constraint, I guess, the big constraint at the moment is getting perhaps the funding to set up the rural development centres, the rural resource centres that can provide the farmer training. But there are many NGOs out there in the countryside, and so there's many people out there who have the capacity to go take this route forward. It just needs, I think, a change in mindset in Washington, in London, in Brussels, etc., to see that this is the way forward for agricultural development.
And we've had several questions regarding the techniques needed in order to implement the agroforestry practices. And so, as you just mentioned, there's lots of resources out there. Are there any training programs that you would recommend, or maybe we can share a list with those with our listeners after the webinar?
I would suggest anybody interested looks at the ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Centre's web page. There are manuals, there are training courses, there are all kinds of ways in which you can get engaged and you can find out that information. And hopefully my book would also point you in those directions.
Great. And just one more question that we have time for today. Do you have any examples that our listeners could learn from of farms or a region or community that are really implementing this really well?
Well, the best example is the example that's been running the longest, which is the Cameroon case that I mentioned several times. That's in the southwest province of Cameroon. It started with a handful of farmers in 2 villages. It's now got up to 10,000, over 10,000 farms in 500 villages. That's happened more or less organically by farmer to farmer dissemination and people talking to one another, aided a little bit by some exercises to try and set up competition between villages and to take farmers from one village to another so that they can see what's going on elsewhere. But basically, it's something which is happening there. It's also happening in many other parts of the world now. I have been involved in similar sorts of projects in the Solomon Islands, in Papua New Guinea, in other parts of Africa, and in Latin America. So it's an approach which is catching on quite fast and beginning to pop up all over the place. But the best example is this Cameroon one, and there's a lot about it in the literature.
Great, thank you, Dr. Leakey. And it sounds like a lot of people will be following up with more information to learn more for their own knowledge as well. So thank you again for joining us today, and thank you again to all of our listeners for sending in their questions. It was truly a pleasure to have you. I just have one announcement that our next webinar will be on September 16th with Dr. Chuck Benbrook. He'll be presenting on the dollars and cents of soil health, and you can register now on foodtank.com. So thank you to everyone again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.